Hello, if you can hear my voice, my dear, I think I've succeeded in encouraging you to learn more about international law. And if that's the case, I can imagine two possibilities. First, this is your first time discovering IntlLaw Academy and you've just started watching one of our videos. Or second, you've seen my previous video and I managed to encourage you to come back, revisit and spend more time with the Academy. And honestly, my dear, that makes me really proud of myself. But for you, dear, who's hearing my voice for the very first time and watching our Academy's videos, look up to the top right corner of the screen. Right there, my dear. If you want to know more about who I am and what I talk about, you can watch the first few minutes of that video, get to know me better, and if you like, join us on this journey. You can also find the previous videos of mine in my playlist. My name is Banu, and I'm happy and honoured to be here today representing the IntlLaw Academy educational videos. Come, my darling, take a quiet seat and listen closely. This part of our story is one of both light and shadow. We are entering the age of conferences and catastrophes, of ideals and empires unravelling. It all begins with a gathering unlike any before, in a small Dutch city nestled by the sea, The Hague. Our story today begins with the First Hague Conference in 1899. It was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia who called the first great meeting of nations, not for war, but to prevent it. In 1899, representatives from 26 states gathered at The Hague. What a moment! For the first time in history, nations sat down not to divide spoils, but to set rules for peace. They dreamed of a more civilized world. The jewels of that gathering include peaceful dispute resolution, laws of war, and humanitarian ideals. They created the Permanent Court of Arbitration, a body to help states resolve disputes without bloodshed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a noble beginning. The conference established the Hague Conventions of 1899, which codified rules about how war could be fought, prohibiting expanding bullets, protecting prisoners of war, and regulating the conduct of sieges. They agreed that war should have limits, even in the heat of battle. Civilian populations, they were to be spared as much as possible. Neutral countries, respected. But let's not fool ourselves, my dear. These were aspirations, not binding obligations. 8 years later, they returned to The Hague. This time, 44 states came together. More voices, more ambition, but also more tension. The shadows of future conflict were already creeping in. This conference expanded on the earlier ones with 13 new conventions. They expanded the rules of warfare, created clearer regulations on naval warfare, the rights of neutral states, and the bombardment of undefended towns. Diplomatic relations got stronger emphasis on respecting neutrality and neutral shipping rights. The Court of Arbitration was given more structure, although the dream of a permanent international court still flickered on the horizon. And yet, my dear, one major hope was not fulfilled: the creation of an international court for compulsory arbitration. Powerful states, like Germany and Britain, refused to be bound. So, you see, though progress was made, the world was still dancing on the edge of a blade. World War I shattered the ideals of The Hague. The very powers that had pledged to uphold international law turned trenches into graves and cities into ruins. Here's what you must know, my darling. The world saw the violation of neutrality as Germany's invasion of Belgium, a neutral state, in 1914, and it was one of the first great breaches of international law in the war. Despite bans from the Hague Conventions, deadly chemical weapons were used on the battlefields. Chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas brought horror to a new scale. Naval blockades, like the British blockade of Germany, led to mass civilian suffering, challenging what was once considered legal conduct in war. For the first time, the skies rained fire. Zeppelins and airplanes bombed civilian areas, a cruel innovation never imagined in the Hague rules. Amid the brutality, humanitarian organisations like the International Committee of the Red Cross fought to uphold dignity in the camps and trenches. And the Ottoman Empire's atrocities. The world witnessed the Armenian genocide, a crime that would echo in legal history and later inspire the very concept of crimes against humanity. Anyway, my dear, in 1918, the guns fell silent. It was the time for law to seek justice. My sweet one, the world had just stumbled out of its darkest night, the Great War, where millions perished and the very earth seemed to bleed. And so, in the cold light of January 1919, the victors gathered in the splendid halls of Paris, but not to celebrate. No, not this time. They came to stitch together the torn fabric of civilization. It was called the Paris Peace Conference, but in truth, it was something much greater, or at least it hoped to be. At the centre of it all stood the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson from across the sea, with his scholar's brow and dreamer's heart; Clemenceau of France, hardened and bitter, a man who had seen too much blood on his soil; Lloyd George of Britain, shrewd and calculating; and Italy's Orlando, full of ambition. Each carried their own burdens, their own hopes. But among them it was Wilson who carried the flame of the idealists, flickering, trembling, but bright. He came with a scroll, not for conquest, but for redemption. His 14 points, my dear, they spoke of open diplomacy, of disarmament, and of self-determination for all peoples. And at their heart it was a vision, a League of Nations, a grand assembly where disputes would be settled by words, not wars. From that conference came many treaties. There was the Treaty of Versailles, which laid the weight of guilt on Germany's shoulders. There were others too: Saint-Germain for Austria, Trianon for Hungary, Neuilly for Bulgaria, and Sèvres for the crumbling Ottoman Empire. They drew new borders, carved up empires, and promised peace. But how heavy were the chains of those promises, especially for Germany? The reparations, the humiliation, they were seeds of resentment buried deep. And yet from that same soil something tender also bloomed: the League of Nations. Born in 1920, its cradle was Geneva. It was the world's first true attempt to stand together, to say never again with more than just tears. Disarmament, peaceful resolution of conflict, protection of minorities, and guidance for former colonies through the mandate system, these were its aims. Noble, yes, but frail. And when the United States, Wilson's own homeland, turned its back and stayed out, the League was left without its strongest voice. And my darling, dreams without power, they tremble. Still, let me tell you of moments where hope danced again. In 1925, the Locarno Treaty, sometimes called Lucky Lucano, brought Germany and France to the same table. They swore to respect borders and to keep peace. It was a springtime for Europe, brief, delicate, and soon forgotten. Then in 1928, the world came together again with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. 60 nations agreed to outlaw war itself. Imagine that! War outlawed like a common crime. It was beautiful, but so unenforced. There were others too, the Berlin Protocols, with their talk of disarmament and cooperation, but not all agreements bore peace. There was the Gleiwitz incident, a staged attack in 1939 by Nazi Germany, a lie crafted to justify the invasion of Poland. That moment, my love, was not diplomacy. It was deceit, and it opened the door to darkness once more. By the 1930s, the world was stumbling again. The Great Depression had shattered economies and trust. Japan stormed into Manchuria, Italy ravaged Ethiopia, and the League, it watched, helpless. Then Germany, under Hitler, began to twist every rule, every treaty. They rearmed, seized Austria, bullied Czechoslovakia, and they appeased, hoping to delay the inevitable. But lies cannot hold back war. In late August 1939, the Gleiwitz deception lit the fuse. On September 1st, the guns roared once more, and World War II began. This war, my darling, it was not just battles between armies. It was a war of ideologies. It was a war of annihilation. The rules written in The Hague, in Geneva, they were cast aside. Civilians became targets. Entire cities, Coventry, Warsaw, Dresden, Hiroshima, turned to ash. Chemical fire rained from the skies. And then there was the Holocaust. 6 million Jews, millions of others, Roma, Slavs, the disabled, political dissidents, hunted, starved, and murdered. It was the very soul of humanity that burned. But even in those ashes, little lights flickered. Brave souls kept records, preserved dignity, whispered truths, and when the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, for Europe and August for Japan, the world made a vow: never again. And that's when our story reaches the last stop of time-travelling history of international law, the birth of United Nations. My sweet listener, when the fires of the Second World War finally dimmed, the world stood among ashes once more. But this time, those who remained did not simply mourn. No, they began to build. They had seen what happens when law fails, when words lose their weight and treaties are torn like paper. And so, long before the final bombs fell, a new vision had already begun to bloom. It started quietly in 1941 on the waves of the Atlantic. President Roosevelt of the United States and Prime Minister Churchill of Britain met on a ship and signed what would be called the Atlantic Charter. It wasn't law, not yet, but it was a promise that after the war, the world would strive for peace, self-determination, economic cooperation, and freedom from fear. Not long after, in 1942, came the Declaration of the United Nations, signed by 26 countries fighting against the Axis. For the first time, the phrase United Nations was spoken not as a hope, but as a commitment. They pledged to win the war and to build peace together after it. Then came more gatherings, little sparks along the path. The Moscow Declaration in 1943, where the Allies agreed to punish war crimes and pursue lasting peace. The Tehran Conference, where the big three, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, began sketching the outline of a new post-war world. These were not mere political meetings, my dear. These were the blueprint drawings of a future. And then, in 1945, a gathering among the quiet snow and solemn pines of Yalta. The Yalta Conference was where they shaped the bones of a new world order. There they agreed. A new international organization would be born. Not like the League, but stronger, with teeth and voice and vision, one that all nations, big and small, could join. Finally, in April of 1945, while the war still flickered in the Pacific, delegates from 50 nations came to San Francisco. And what a moment it was, my darling. They debated, they dreamed, and they signed the United Nations Charter, the birth certificate of a new age. It began with powerful words. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And thus the United Nations came into being. A structure of peace, imperfect, yes, but made of purpose. It gave rise to the International Court of Justice, a guardian of the law among nations. It reaffirmed the dignity of every human life through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And the law, my dear, it did not stop there. It began to grow like a tree after fire, its roots deeper for the suffering. Treaties, conventions and protocols blossomed in every direction. Geneva Conventions were strengthened to protect the wounded, the prisoners, the civilians. International humanitarian law took shape, placing limits on war itself. Human rights law flourished, defending the voices of women, children, the oppressed. Environmental law rose in defense of our Earth. Maritime law, space law, even cyber law all began to take form. We saw the creation of international criminal tribunals for Nuremberg, Rwanda and Yugoslavia. And then finally in 2002, the International Criminal Court, where individuals, not just states, could be held accountable. International law, you see, is not a museum. It is a living language, always learning, always reaching. It negotiates climate change, it governs trade, it protects refugees, it regulates outer space and watches over the deep sea. It grows in response to every crisis. Every injustice gives birth to new norms. Every silence challenges us to speak, from Nuremberg to The Hague, from peacekeeping missions to climate accords, from war crimes trials to declarations on indigenous rights. The law keeps moving. It is fragile, yes, but it is resilient. And the United Nations, for all its flaws, remains the great table where the world still dares to sit and speak rather than shoot. So, my darling, know this. International law is not just a book or a courtroom. It is a mirror. It shows us who we are and who we could be. It is creative. It is evolving. It breathes with every generation and with every voice that dares to ask what is right. The law listens and grows.